She was born with eyes that carried the softness of dawn and a spirit that seemed to harmonize with every living thing around her. From the earliest days of her childhood, people in the village often said she had been kissed by the morning wind, for her laughter was like the rustle of leaves and her steps were as light as a sparrow skipping across the earth. She had no desire for riches, no interest in fine cloth, nor any hunger for power. Her greatest joy was to sit beneath the wide branches of the old trees, weaving small flowers into garlands, humming gentle tunes, or speaking to the river as though it could answer back. Those who truly looked at her could see the innocence that wrapped around her like a cloak, a purity that was both fragile and unshakable at the same time. Yet, within her own home, that purity was treated like a burden instead of a gift. Her family was not poor, but their hearts were chained with greed. Her father had once been gentle before, but after her mother's death, he grew harder, more restless, chasing wealth as though it might fill the emptiness left behind. Her stepmother, with eyes sharp as knives and a tongue dipped in venom, made sure the girl never forgot her place. She was given the heaviest chores, fetching water until her shoulders ached, scrubbing floors until her fingers cracked, and cooking meals she was rarely allowed to taste. When the family gathered to eat, she was left with scraps, yet her smile never fully faded. She still whispered to the plants she tended in the yard, still sang to the birds who perched near her window, still found small happiness in the warmth of the earth beneath her bare feet. There was something about her that even the cruel could not destroy. Neighbors noticed how the stray dogs wagged their tails when she passed, how the withering plants revived when her hands touched them, how children ran to her when they were upset, certain that her quiet voice would soothe them. It was as though she carried a secret bond with the natural world, one that asked for nothing yet gave endlessly. But this very purity that drew affection from the simple and the innocent stirred bitterness in those who lived beside her. Her stepmother despised the way villagers smiled at her, for she wanted the admiration directed at herself. Her father, blinded by ambition, saw no value in gentleness that brought no wealth. Even her step-siblings, spoiled and sharp-tongued, mocked her for being too soft, calling her the useless flower and the weeper of animals. But the girl never retaliated. She bowed her head and accepted their taunts, not out of weakness, but out of a quiet strength they could not understand. She carried inside her the belief that kindness was not foolishness, that patience was not surrender. She believed the earth listened when she prayed, that the skies watched even when no human eyes did, and that every cruel act would one day find its mirror. Though her family thought her powerless, she was far from alone. The grass bent toward her feet as she walked. The wind seemed to wait for her sighs. Even the silence of the night held her softly, as though it guarded her while she slept. Still, she longed for something more than endurance. She dreamed of love, not in the form of riches or grandeur, but in the simple way a hand might hold hers without cruelty, in the way a voice might speak to her without scorn. She often wondered if her mother's spirit watched over her, if somewhere beyond the stars she was being guided toward a destiny hidden beneath her suffering. Yet every morning, those dreams faded when she was awoken by sharp commands, by the sound of her stepmother's foot tapping impatiently, by her father's silence that hurt more than words. She was a prisoner in her own home, a jewel buried in dust. The villagers sometimes pitied her, but they never spoke against her family. Greed and fear silenced their tongues. They could see her bent back as she carried baskets twice her size. They could see her hands blistered from endless labor. Yet none dared to interfere, for her father's wealth and her stepmother's sharp influence stretched long shadows over the community. The girl learned early that compassion from others was a rare blessing, and so she turned deeper toward the companionship of the unseen. She poured her heart into the soil when planting seeds, spoke softly to the goats when feeding them, and traced the clouds in the sky as though they could carry her wishes upward. In all of this she remained pure-hearted, her spirit unbroken. But what she did not know was that her very innocence, her ability to remain gentle in a world of cruelty, would become the spark of envy that pushed her family into their darkest deed. For in their greedy eyes she was not a daughter, not a sister, not even a human soul worthy of love. She was a possession, a thing to be traded, a body whose worth could be measured in livestock and bargains. And so, while she dreamed under the moon of a gentler tomorrow, her fate was already being whispered about in the corners of her own home. The girl, with her bond to nature and her heart as soft as river water, remained unaware of how deeply the cruelty around her was sharpening its edge. She only knew how to love, how to forgive, how to endure. But innocence, when tested too far, can awaken powers even the cruelest hearts cannot imagine. And the day would come when those who mistreated her would discover that the ground beneath them, the animals they owned, and even the cow they so coveted, were not theirs to command, but silent witnesses waiting for justice. The day began like any other, with the sun painting the earth in gold and the wind carrying whispers of trees and grasses, but for the girl it was a day that would change everything. She had always been gentle, with eyes that seemed to reflect more kindness than most people ever received in their lifetimes. Nature had loved her, or so it seemed. Birds perched close without fear, flowers turned in her direction as if reaching for her warmth, and streams that trickled near her home always seemed clearer when she was near. But her family, blinded by greed, had never seen her as a gift. To them she was just another burden, someone who could be exchanged for gain. Whispers of poverty and hunger had filled their household for months, but instead of laboring with dignity, her relatives searched for shortcuts. They saw her beauty, her innocence, her youth, and where others saw light, they saw currency. It began with casual talk, murmured at night when she was asleep. One spoke of the wealthy man in the neighboring village, another mentioned his desire for a young wife, and soon greed laid its roots in their hearts. Their poverty was not the sharpest thorn. They were pierced most cruelly by their desire for more, their hunger for wealth and possession. It was not long before they began to treat her differently. Her laughter, once tolerated, now brought them annoyance. Her questions about life were dismissed with irritation. They reminded her often that she was dependent on them, that her life was not her own but something they had given and could just as easily take away. Each word chipped away at her fragile heart, though she tried to cling to the kindness of the earth around her. Then came the day the wealthy man arrived. He was broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to fill every space he entered. His gaze was heavy and assessing, the kind of look that stripped away dignity and weighed worth like livestock in a market. He had heard of her beauty, of her grace, and came not for her heart but for possession. He wanted her as one might want land or cattle, a thing to control, to own, to boast about. The girl's family greeted him with false smiles, bowing and speaking as though they had been waiting for him all along. Their words dripped with flattery, each one carefully polished to hide the sharpness of their intent. In the center of their meeting place, tethered calmly, stood a cow, healthy, strong, and silent. Its large brown eyes seemed to glisten with quiet wisdom, its body gleaming under the sun as though it understood more than the humans who bartered around it. The man's offer was simple, the cow in exchange for the girl. He placed his hand on the animal's back, speaking of its strength, its milk, its value. Her relatives nodded eagerly, their eyes fixed not on her but on the creature that represented their imagined escape from hardship. In their hearts, the cow was worth far more than her tears, her smile, her dreams. To them she was expendable, replaceable. The girl, standing silently at the edge of the gathering, felt her chest tighten with dread. She wanted to cry out, to ask how those who shared her blood could so easily hand her away, but the weight of their cruelty pressed her voice back down her throat. She felt the earth beneath her bare feet, the ground she had walked since childhood, and silently begged it for strength. The cow turned its head, eyes meeting hers, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw sorrow there, as though the animal mourned the bargain as much as she did. The exchange was made quickly, almost casually. A nod, a handshake, a cow's rope passed from one hand to another, and her fate was sealed. Her relatives' faces lit up with greed, already planning how they would use the cow, how it would elevate them above others, how it would mark them as clever and fortunate. None of them looked at her, not really, not as a daughter, a niece, a sister. They looked at her as one looks at a thing already sold, already gone. The wealthy man's shadow fell over her, and his hand gripped her wrist with possession, not tenderness. She wanted to run, to scream, but the voices around her celebrated as though this were a triumph, not a betrayal. She felt the warmth of tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. And yet the cow did not move. Its hooves stayed planted firmly in the soil, its large body rooted like a tree unwilling to be shifted. It looked at the girl again, and this time its eyes glimmered with something ancient, something waiting. The relatives tugged at its rope, coaxed it forward, but it only shook its head softly, as though it understood that it had not truly been bought, that this bargain carried a price yet to be paid. The girl was led away, her heart heavy with despair, her soul bruised by betrayal. But in the quiet gaze of the cow, in the unspoken resistance of its stillness, something stirred. The bargain was complete in their eyes, but in the balance of the world, it was only the beginning. The days that followed her sale felt like a chain tightening around her neck, one she could neither break nor loosen. The girl, once known for her gentle heart and quiet bond with nature, was now reduced to a possession, a piece of property that her new master flaunted like a trophy. She was no longer called by her name, only girl, slave, or worse, words spat with cruelty meant to remind her of her worthlessness in their eyes. The family that had given her away had severed all ties, leaving her alone to face the weight of her suffering. From the first morning in her new home, she was burdened with endless tasks. She was ordered to sweep the vast compound before the sun rose, to fetch water from the river with jars so heavy they cut into her skin, to cook meals that she was never allowed to eat, and to scrub floors until her hands blistered and bled. The master and his household treated her less like a human and more like a tool to be used, discarded, and commanded at will. Her back ached from carrying loads too heavy for her frame, her legs wobbled with exhaustion, but no complaint ever left her lips. For every sign of fatigue she was met with harsh words, sometimes a strike of the hand, sometimes the lash of a stick. Meals were withheld from her, and when she was permitted to eat, it was scraps thrown to the ground as if she were an animal. The taste of dust often mixed with her food, and yet she forced herself to chew to survive, because somewhere deep inside her, she believed her life was more than this cruelty. She remembered the whisper of the wind in the fields of her childhood, the songs of birds that had once followed her steps, the way the earth itself seemed to know her heart. That memory gave her strength in moments when despair tried to crush her spirit. The humiliation cut deeper than the pain of labor. The master paraded her before his friends, boasting of how cheaply he had acquired her, laughing as they commented on her beauty while mocking her lack of freedom. Sometimes they demanded that she dance or sing, not for her joy but for their amusement, and when her voice faltered under the weight of sorrow, they jeered. Each cruel demand stripped away a piece of dignity, but in the quiet of night, when she lay on the bare ground of her small corner, she held tight to the fragments of herself they could not reach, her dreams, her memories, her bond with the unseen forces of the world. There were nights when she cried silently, her tears soaking the earth beneath her, but she never let them hear her. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her spirit break. Instead, she bore her pain quietly, her silence becoming a kind of shield. The household thought it was weakness, but it was not. It was endurance. It was strength that burned quietly, waiting for its time to rise. The cow, tethered not far from the compound, seemed to watch her as the days passed. Whenever she was beaten or humiliated, its gaze would fall on her with strange intensity, as if it understood. In those moments, the girl felt less alone, as though the silence of the animal carried some hidden promise. But the master's household never noticed. To them, it was only a beast as ordinary as any other, though they still whispered uneasily about its unsettling quiet. Her suffering stretched on, each day blending into the next, but beneath her torment was a truth none of them could see: pain had not destroyed her. Instead, it was shaping her, hardening her spirit, weaving into her soul the strength of mountains and rivers. They believed they had bought her, stripped her of worth, and bent her into submission, but the girl they mistreated was not so easily broken. The cruelty she endured became a seed planted deep within the soil of her being, one that would someday grow into something they could neither control nor survive. For every lash of humiliation, for every command barked at her, for every cruel laugh that sought to reduce her humanity, the earth itself listened. And though she was powerless in that moment, she was not forgotten. She carried her suffering like a cloak, silent and heavy, but behind her weary eyes burned the faint light of destiny. They thought they had enslaved a girl. In truth, they had chained themselves to a fate they could not yet see, a fate that watched through the calm, patient eyes of the cow standing near. The days of her suffering stretched long and heavy, but something in the compound began to shift. It was not the cruelty of her master softening, it never did. It was not the kindness of her relatives returning, they had forgotten her. No, the change came from the cow, the very creature for which she had been sold. At first no one noticed. It stood tethered as always, chewing slowly, blinking with the dull patience of any beast. But the girl, who had grown used to observing silently, saw it first. Its eyes lingered too long on those who had bartered her life away. Its silence was not the ordinary silence of an animal but something deeper, almost watchful, almost knowing. When her master passed by the tethered cow, it would lift its head sharply, its nostrils flaring, its gaze following him with unnerving intensity. Servants who went too close to it claimed that its eyes gleamed strangely in the dusk, like embers glowing beneath the surface of water. At night, when the fires in the compound dimmed, its low rumbling breaths seemed louder, echoing through the darkness like a presence that refused to be ignored. Those who had conspired to trade the girl for the animal began to shift uneasily in its presence, though they would not admit their fear aloud. The girl herself often caught the cow watching her. Its gaze was not cruel like her master's, not mocking like the villagers when they jeered, but heavy with something she could not yet name. Sometimes it looked sorrowful, as though it carried her pain within itself. Other times, its eyes burned in a way that made her shiver, as though it remembered what had been done and waited for something unseen. The bond she had once felt with nature flickered faintly whenever her gaze met its own, a quiet reminder that she was not utterly abandoned. Stories began to spread among the servants. Some swore that when the master's hand lifted in cruelty, the cow's eyes blazed red for an instant. Others whispered that in the quietest hours of the night, when the compound was asleep, it shifted its weight as though pacing, its hooves striking the ground like muted drums. A child once claimed to have heard it breathe words, though the adults laughed and silenced him quickly, unwilling to give voice to such fears. The guilty tried to dismiss these things, brushing them off as tricks of light or the foolishness of frightened minds. Yet unease crept into their bones. When they approached the cow, they felt a heaviness settle on them, as though unseen eyes beyond its own were weighing their souls. Even the bravest among them refused to meet its gaze for long. Some claimed the air grew colder when they passed it, or that shadows bent strangely around its tether. The girl, though trapped in her suffering, drew a strange comfort from the whispers. In the stillness of night, she sometimes whispered back to the animal, telling it her grief, her longing, her memories of the river and the fields. The cow never moved, never spoke, yet its steady gaze seemed to listen, as though it carried her words into some hidden depth. She began to believe, though she dared not say it aloud, that this cow was not ordinary flesh and bone. It was something else, a vessel, a watcher, a silent witness to cruelty waiting for the time to act. The master's household grew restless. The more they mocked the girl, the more unsettled they became in the cow's presence. Its silence seemed to accuse them, though it made no sound. Its eyes gleamed at dusk and dawn, reflecting a truth they did not want to see. Some claimed they saw themselves in its gaze not as they were, but as broken, bloodied, hollow things. Fear gnawed at them, though they cloaked it in anger and shouted louder commands at the girl to drown out the unease. And still the cow watched. It did not bellow, it did not fight against its tether, but its silence was heavier than thunder, its patience more terrifying than rage. The girl, beaten and humiliated, endured her suffering with quiet strength, and in the shadows the cow's presence grew more dreadful, more unnatural, until even the guilty began to wonder if they had not sold her to a man, but to something far greater, and far more dangerous, than they understood. It began quietly, as all omens do, with something that might have been dismissed as chance. The man was one of her greedy relatives, the loudest voice in selling her life away. He had boasted of the cow often, calling it his prize, claiming it was worth more than the girl ever could be. His laughter had rung sharp in her memory the day she was led away, and though she had long grown numb to her pain, she remembered his face well. It was he who first felt the weight of what had been unleashed. On a morning when the mist still clung low to the ground, he set out for his field. His steps were confident as always, but there was an odd stillness in the air. The wind did not move the trees. Birds that should have been stirring at dawn were silent. Even his own breath sounded too loud in his ears. As he walked, he felt a pressure as though eyes followed him. Turning, he caught sight of the cow in the distance, tethered in the master's compound. Its head was raised, its gaze locked on him, though the distance between them was too great for such certainty. Yet he felt it, its eyes were on him, heavy and unblinking as if holding him to account. He shook it off, muttering curses under his breath. But the feeling lingered, an invisible hand pressing at his back. In his field, he bent to inspect his tools, only to find them rusted overnight, though they had been whole the evening before. When he tried to work with them anyway, the handle of his hoe splintered in his grip, slicing his palm. Blood welled, dark and thick, staining the earth. He hissed in pain, clutching his hand, and it was then he saw it again, the cow distant still, yet impossibly watching him. Its eyes gleamed in the morning light, catching the red of his blood as if reflecting it back. The man grew uneasy, but stubborn pride pushed him to continue. He turned to the oxen, but they would not move. Their eyes rolled white, nostrils flaring, hooves stamping the ground in agitation. No coaxing or beating could calm them, and they pulled away from his harness with wild snorts, as though spooked by an unseen predator. He shouted in anger, raising his hand to strike them, but before the blow could land, his foot slipped. The ground beneath him, firm just moments before, seemed to give way. He toppled forward, landing hard, the sharp stones gashing his forehead. His cry echoed, but no one came to help. As he struggled to his knees, dazed, the soil seemed darker than before, damp though no rain had fallen. The metallic scent of his blood mingled with the earth, and he felt for the first time that something was drinking it in. His ears rang with a low sound, not the wind, not the animals, but a deep, steady rhythm, like a heart beating underground. When he lifted his head again, his eyes were drawn irresistibly back toward the compound. The cow was still there, unmoving, yet its eyes glowed faintly as if they had captured the light of hidden fire. Terror clawed at him, though he tried to mask it with anger. He stumbled home, clutching his wounds, muttering that it was bad luck, nothing more. But the story spread quickly among the villagers who saw him return bloodied and shaken. Whispers grew that the cow's gaze had cursed him, that its silence was not the silence of an animal but the patience of a spirit. Some dismissed it, claiming accidents happened, that he had simply been clumsy. Yet others felt the chill in the air and remembered how the girl had been sold for that very beast. That night, he tried to sleep, but dreams came, dreams of hooves pounding closer and closer, of eyes gleaming in the dark, of his own reflection staring back at him from the cow's gaze, twisted and broken. He woke in a sweat, his body aching, the sound of low breathing filling his hut though no one else was there. The fear he had tried to push aside could no longer be ignored. The villagers noticed his decline. His laughter, once loud and cruel, grew hollow. His body weakened, his steps unsteady. And all the while, the cow stood silent in the compound, chewing calmly, its dark eyes unblinking. Those who dared glance at it swore that whenever he walked past, it turned its head deliberately to follow him, as though it marked him for something yet to come. When he finally collapsed in the center of the village, blood seeping from his mouth without cause, no one dared touch him at first. They looked instead to the cow, standing still, its gaze upon the fallen man. A shiver passed through the crowd, and even those who had scoffed before lowered their eyes, unable to bear its stare. For the first time, the villagers whispered aloud what they had all secretly feared. The cow was not just an animal. It was waiting. It had begun. The night was thick with unease, the kind of stillness that presses against the chest and makes every sound too sharp to ignore. In the master's compound, the cow stood tethered, its massive body casting a long shadow under the moonlight. Normally by this hour it would have bent its head to graze or drunk from the trough set carefully beside it, but this night was different. Its mouth never touched the grass, its tongue never sought the water. It simply stood, silent and motionless, its dark eyes reflecting the moon as if holding the night itself within them. The villagers who passed by on their way home from evening gatherings slowed their steps, whispering nervously. A cow that would not eat or drink was considered an ill omen, a sign that misfortune had entered the community. Some said perhaps it was sick, but no one could deny the way it lifted its head whenever someone approached, fixing them with a gaze too intelligent, too deliberate to be natural. The children clung to their mother's skirts, muttering about the beast's glowing eyes, and the elders shook their heads, recalling ancient tales of animals carrying spirits of vengeance. Inside the household that had bought the girl, tension gnawed at every corner. The master scowled as he peered out into the courtyard, muttering curses at the animal. He had paid dearly for it, paid with the girl's life, and now it behaved as though mocking him. He tried to coax it at first, throwing handfuls of fresh grass, then pushing the trough closer with his foot. But the cow did not so much as lower its head. Its breathing was steady, slow, each rise and fall of its chest echoing like the rhythm of a drum that only it could hear. By midnight, more villagers had gathered, curiosity overcoming fear. They kept a cautious distance, yet their eyes were drawn to the animal's stillness. The longer they watched, the heavier the air seemed to become. Some swore they heard a low sound, not quite a moo, but a rumbling hum that reverberated through the ground. Others claimed the smell of blood lingered faintly in the air, though no animal had been slaughtered that day. The whispers grew. Perhaps the girl's spirit had clung to the cow, perhaps the transaction had offended the unseen powers of earth and sky. In the quiet of that night, dogs refused to bark, and chickens huddled together as though in fear. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, leaving the trees stiff and unmoving. When one villager dared to step closer and peer into the cow's eyes, he stumbled back at once, pale and trembling. He swore that he had seen his own face reflected there, not as he was, but pale and lifeless, lips blue as though drowned. The master shouted at the growing crowd, ordering them to return to their homes, insisting the animal was merely stubborn. Yet even his voice cracked, betraying the fear he would not admit. His relatives, the ones who had sold the girl, exchanged uneasy glances. They remembered the first accident, the blood that had stained the earth, and now the cow's refusal to eat felt like a silent demand. Something was waiting. The night dragged on, and though many left, they did so with hurried steps, whispering prayers under their breath. Those who remained swore they saw the cow's nostrils flare, as though it scented blood that was not yet spilled. Its ears twitched, not at insects or night sounds, but in sync with the terrified heartbeats of the men and women watching. When dawn finally broke, the cow was still standing, untouched, grass scattered before it, water rippling untouched in its trough. The villagers left with unease in their eyes, whispering that the beast was cursed, that its silence was a warning of blood to come. And though no one spoke it aloud, all of them thought of the girl, the one sold for its sake, the one whose pain seemed to linger in the cow's unblinking gaze. It was not hunger that bound the animal. It was waiting, patient and relentless, for justice to feed. The reckoning began quietly, without thunder or lightning, without the kind of storm people usually expected when curses revealed themselves. It started with the uneasy silence that crept over the village. The once bustling market, full of laughter and bargaining, now echoed with whispers. Mothers drew their children indoors earlier than usual, men looked over their shoulders as though hunted, and even the wind seemed to carry a chill that did not belong to the season. At the center of this growing unease was the cow, the very cow they had traded the girl for. It had become a shadow haunting the guilty, its quiet presence more frightening than a lion's roar. It no longer grazed peacefully, it watched. Wherever those who betrayed her walked, the cow's dark eyes followed, heavy, unblinking, and almost human in their awareness. The first to fall was the uncle who had argued most strongly for the bargain. He had laughed when the cow was brought home, boasting of his cleverness in exchanging a girl for wealth and sustenance. One night, as he stumbled home from drinking palm wine, he slipped in the dark. But when the villagers found him at dawn, his body was twisted unnaturally, his face frozen in terror as though he had seen something unspeakable. Blood seeped into the soil beneath him, staining the earth crimson. The cow was there, standing silently a short distance away, its muzzle wet, its eyes glowing faintly in the half-light of dawn. The whispers began then, growing louder, spreading through the village like a sickness. The cow is watching. The cow is waiting. Soon after, the girl's aunt, who had urged her to obey and accept her fate, fell ill. At first, it was nothing more than a fever, but her sickness worsened in ways no healer could understand. She cried out in her sleep, calling the girl's name, begging for forgiveness, clawing at her sheets as though unseen hands were dragging her into the earth. When her body finally gave way, her last breath came out in a strangled scream, and her eyes stared wide as if fixed on something looming above her. That night, the cow was seen outside her hut, staring into the darkness, its hooves pawing the ground as if impatient. The others grew restless. The brother who had once mocked his sister's tears began to sweat at the sight of the cow. He avoided its gaze, but the animal seemed to follow him wherever he went, waiting patiently, never in a hurry, never needing to chase. His end came not from sickness nor accident but from a violent quarrel with another villager. As blows were exchanged, he stumbled back and struck his head on a stone, the sharp crack echoing through the evening air. The cow was there again, chewing nothing, its jaw working soundlessly, as if it fed not on grass but on guilt itself. Blood trickled from the man's wound into the soil, and again the earth drank greedily. By now the village knew. The curse was not wild speculation. It was real, alive, and steady in its unfolding. Each drop of blood that fed the ground seemed to strengthen the quiet vengeance that walked in the form of the cow. Families locked their doors, but the guilty could find no refuge. They dreamt of the girl they had betrayed, her eyes filled with sorrow, her hands reaching up from the soil, her voice carried in the low, rumbling breath of the beast they had brought into their midst. When the patriarch himself, the one who had sealed the bargain, finally collapsed, it was not in secret but in full view of the villagers. He had been standing near the edge of the compound when his chest tightened and his breath caught. He fell to his knees, gasping, clutching at the air as though fighting invisible chains. The cow stepped forward, its heavy hooves thudding against the earth, and let out a sound, low, mournful and heavy, that silenced the entire village. Blood seeped from the old man's mouth as he toppled forward, his lifeless body feeding the soil that had already drunk so much from the guilty. By now terror ruled every heart. None could deny what was happening. The bargain had not brought them fortune, but a curse so patient and relentless that no prayer could undo it. One by one, every relative who had played a role in selling her met their end. The ground grew damp with their blood, and in every death the cow stood nearby, neither rushing nor retreating. It did not need to chase, it only needed to wait. The earth itself seemed to thirst for the guilt of those who had betrayed innocence, and the cow was its messenger, its collector. The villagers trembled, realizing the truth too late. The girl they had cast aside had not been forgotten. She had become something more, her spirit woven into the very earth beneath their feet, her suffering transformed into a force that demanded retribution. And the cow, silent and unwavering, was the herald of her justice. It would not leave until the blood of every betrayer had seeped into the soil, until the ground itself was satisfied. When the last of the guilty had fallen and the ground had drunk its fill of blood, the village grew eerily quiet. The nights that had once been filled with the sound of fearful whispers became heavy with silence. The curse had run its course, its work methodical and unrelenting, until there were no more betrayers left to claim. And then, as dawn broke over the village, the cow turned its head and began to walk. Slowly, steadily, its hooves pressed into the soil as though it had always known where it was meant to lead. The villagers, who had once avoided its gaze, now watched from behind doors and fences, too afraid to follow but too transfixed to look away. They knew it was moving toward her, the girl they had cast aside. She had not been seen for weeks, swallowed into a life of servitude, beaten down and forced into silence. Yet when the cow stopped at the edge of the forest, she appeared. She stepped out from the shadows barefoot, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face neither broken nor bitter but changed in a way that silenced every heart. She no longer carried the weight of fear. Where others expected a girl marked by pain, they saw instead someone walking in quiet power, her presence heavy with the same stillness that had haunted the cow. The villagers whispered among themselves, unable to reconcile how she had survived or why she seemed untouched by the cruelty that had been inflicted on her. The cow lowered its head when she approached, and without hesitation, she laid her hand on its brow. For a moment, it seemed like nothing more than a gesture of comfort. But those who watched closely swore they saw the animal shudder, its eyes glowing faintly, as though her touch bound them in an understanding older and deeper than words. The two walked side by side into the heart of the village, and every door they passed closed tightly, every face turned away in shame. She did not need to speak. Her silence was louder than accusation, heavier than judgment. She carried herself not as a victim but as someone who had endured and emerged transformed, someone the curse itself had risen to defend. When she reached the compound that had once been her prison, she paused. The cow stopped beside her, its eyes fixed on the bloodstains still darkening the earth. The huts that had been filled with the voices of her relatives now stood hollow, their silence echoing with the memory of betrayal. She looked at the ground, at the soil that had taken what was owed, and she breathed deeply, not of grief but of release. The curse had already done its work. There was no need for revenge in her heart, because justice had already walked before her. The villagers expected her to leave, to vanish into the forest with the cow at her side, but she remained. She tended the earth where blood had been spilled, planting seeds as though to remind the soil of its purpose beyond vengeance. Children crept closer, curious, and found that in her presence there was no threat. The cow, once a figure of terror, now grazed quietly by her side, its earlier glow fading into something gentler, almost protective. She smiled at the children, and for the first time, laughter returned timidly to the village. But no one forgot what had happened. The story of her suffering and survival became the breath of every firelit tale. The elders spoke of how greed had brought ruin, how innocence had awakened a force the guilty could not escape. The girl, once voiceless and powerless, now walked freely wherever she wished, no longer bound by family or servitude. Wherever she went, the cow followed, not as a beast of burden but as a guardian, a reminder, and a companion. Together, they were a living memory of what had been lost and what had been restored. She had been sold like property, reduced to nothing more than an exchange for flesh and milk. Yet now she was something more than even the villagers could name. They feared her and revered her in equal measure, for she was no longer a victim but a symbol, the girl who could not be broken, who walked beside the silent watcher that had delivered justice. And in the stillness of night, when the wind carried her footsteps through the quiet paths of the village, people would murmur a single truth that none dared deny: the girl was free but she was never alone. They say stories begin with whispers, and her story began with one that no one dared silence. After the downfall of her greedy kin, after the blood had darkened the soil and the cow had walked beside her like a shadow of judgment, people in the village began to speak her name with reverence, though none dared call it aloud in her presence. Children repeated it in hushed tones, weaving it into games and songs. Elders shook their heads and warned against forgetting the fate of those who thought they could bargain away a human soul. Her life, once dismissed as nothing more than a trade, became a thread stitched into the fabric of every tale told by the fireside, and that tale grew into legend. The villagers claimed that the ground itself remembered, that the earth still bore the scent of blood long after the rains had washed the stains away. They swore that no grass would grow in the places where the guilty had fallen, no matter how many seeds were sown. Those patches of barren earth became sacred in their own way, warnings carved by nature that greed was never free of cost. Travelers passing through would ask why such marks scarred the land, and the villagers would answer with the story of the girl sold for a cow, whose innocence drew out the wrath of the earth. They would speak of the cow not as an animal but as an omen, a creature that saw what no human eyes could see. From that time on, cattle were no longer viewed as mere property. The villagers began to watch them closely, fearful and awed. When a cow turned its head sharply, people whispered that it had seen someone's hidden sin. When a cow refused to eat, they grew anxious, believing a reckoning might be near. If a cow lowed at night without reason, families gathered together in fear, wondering who among them had brought darkness upon the household. The legend taught them that cows could see truths humans ignored, that their silence was not emptiness but awaiting judgment. Children grew up with the warning that to mistreat the innocent was to invite the gaze of beasts that looked simple but carried wisdom older than mankind. Her name faded, but her story sharpened, repeated across villages, stretched across rivers and hills, carried by wandering traders and storytellers. Some told it as a parable of greed, that those who hunger for wealth without honor feed the ground with their own blood. Others told it as a myth of transformation, that the girl had merged her spirit with the cow, walking between worlds, appearing whenever injustice sought to take root. Still others swore that she had simply gone on living quietly, tending her crops with the cow grazing beside her, but that her presence alone kept the village from returning to cruelty. Whether she had become spirit or remained flesh, the villagers agreed on one truth: the earth itself had chosen her as its witness. Generations passed, but the blood-fed ground remained. Children were forbidden to play there. Lovers avoided it at night. Offerings of food and milk were sometimes left at its edge, as if the soil itself might consume them in place of human blood. During harvest season, villagers carried bowls of grain to the cow's descendants, whispering prayers that their greed might never awaken the same curse. And though time dulled many tales, this one only sharpened, growing weightier with every retelling. Travelers who heard the legend spoke of how its meaning spread beyond one village. Neighboring clans began to treat their cattle differently, no longer as silent beasts but as guardians, silent judges of the living. Rituals arose where people watched the behavior of cows before marriages, journeys, or disputes. If the cow turned away, the event was delayed, for its disapproval was seen as a bad omen. If the cow ate calmly, it was taken as a blessing. And if the cow stared with unblinking eyes, people grew pale, for they said the beast had seen a hidden cruelty that the earth itself would not allow to remain unpunished. The girl herself became less a figure of flesh and more a figure of spirit in the minds of those who told her tale. Some said she still walked the earth, ageless, leading a pale cow with eyes like burning embers. Others swore that in times of great injustice, when blood cried silently in the hearts of the innocent, the soil trembled and the cow's heavy breath was felt in the air, reminding mortals of the curse they could not escape. Mothers told their daughters never to fear their own innocence, for the earth watched closely, and its patience was endless but not forgetful. Fathers told their sons never to place greed above kinship, for what they gained in flesh would be taken from them in blood. Over time, people stopped asking whether the tale was true. Truth mattered less than the shadow it cast. The barren earth still bore its mark, the cattle still carried their quiet power, and the story was etched so deeply into the villagers' hearts that no one dared to doubt it. For in every generation, someone would recount the tale of how greed sold a girl, how silence walked in the form of a cow, and how the ground itself drank the blood of those who thought themselves untouchable. And so the legend of the blood-fed ground endured. It became more than a memory, it became a law of the unseen, a reminder that cruelty never disappears, only circles back. The villagers lived with caution, knowing the earth was not empty but listening. And when they heard a cow's low cry at night, their hearts quickened, for they remembered, greed always returns not as gold or wealth but as blood upon the earth.